Why is soy sauce salty? Why does kimchi taste crazily sour and spicy? And why does Swiss cheese have holes? All the foods I mentioned have completely different flavors, but all of them are made from tiny organisms, namely yeast, bacteria, and mold, who eat on sugar until they eventually produce these goodies. Let's start with yeast. Yeast is a single-celled organism called Saccharomyces cerevisiae, which needs food, warmth, and moisture to thrive. It converts or breaks down its food, like sugar and starch, through fermentation into carbon dioxide and alcohol. They have two different ways to do this, through oxygen-dependent aerobic respiration or through oxygen-independent anaerobic respiration, which is also called fermentation. When bed break, yeast may use both ways, but it normally starts with the anaerobic process of fermentation. In this process, both CO2 and ethanol are produced. However, the tiny amounts of alcohol would evaporate during the process of baking. In oxygen-dependent pathway respiration, the yeast eats some of the sugar and produces both CO2 and water. In both processes, the CO2 builds up and creates tiny bubbles. These bubbles get trapped by gluten, and the gluten should be flexible enough to allow the bubbles to expand, but sturdy enough to prevent them from bursting. This creates a sponge-like structure, which gives the bread its softness. Wine also relies on yeast, but the oxygen levels need to be low, so that the yeast eats sugar through anaerobic respiration. The process often starts with yeast already on the grapes, but for consistency in the production, most winemakers also add selected strains of yeast that can tolerate high levels of alcohol. The yeast eats sugar in the grape juice, and as the sugar level lowers, the alcohol level goes higher. This doesn't mean that the sweeter wines have less alcohol, however. You may be thinking, what happens to all the carbon dioxide? Well, it just goes away through a vent. In carbonated alcoholic beverages like beer, however, they keep the carbon dioxide in the bottle. Wine also utilizes the second type of food-producing microorganism, bacteria. A certain strain of bacteria turns tart-tasting malic acid in grape juice into softer-tasting ones that are responsible for some of the flavors in red wines. This process is called malolactic fermentation. There is another type of bacteria called acetic acid bacteria. You don't really want them in your wine, as it is used somewhere else. Because what it does is, if there's oxygen around, these bacteria convert the ethanol in wine into acetic acid. This process will eventually produce vinegar. Bacteria can make cheese too though. To make cheese, milk is inoculated with bacteria. The bacteria eats up the lactose found in the milk and produce lactic acid. As the milk gets more and more acidic, its proteins start to form curds, which is why spoiled milk has clumps. Cheesemakers usually add an enzyme called rennet, which is naturally found inside some mammals to help in with the process. Eventually, those curds turn into big curds, which are pressed to squeeze out the water, and after that, it creates cheese. It is important to note that different strains of bacteria make different kinds of cheese. Like how Propionibacterium fruthenreichiae, a species of bacteria that emits carbon dioxide, is what gives Swiss cheese its holes. Some cheeses, like Gorgonzola, utilizes our last kind of microorganism, mold. So, the next time your teacher asks you where cheese comes from, don't just say cows. That isn't the complete answer. Say that these microorganisms help out too. But it is important to know that you shouldn't eat too much, because due to the high probiotic content of fermented foods, the most common side effect would be a temporary increase in gas and bloating.